Louisiana Superdome, New Orleans, March 29, 1982. The building held 62,000 people, the largest crowd ever assembled for a college basketball game at that point in the sport's history, and almost none of them had come specifically to watch Michael Jordan. He was 19 years old and a freshman at the University of North Carolina. He had averaged 13.5 points and 4.5 rebounds in his first college season, numbers that the scouting community had noticed and that the college basketball press had reported, but that had not yet accumulated into a public narrative about who Jordan was or what he was capable of doing when the situation demanded the most from him. The national conversation about this game, in the days before it was played, was organized around two other people: James Worthy, the North Carolina junior and first-team All-American, whose 28-point performances had been the engine of Carolina's tournament run, and Patrick Ewing, the Georgetown freshman whose 7-foot presence at center had reorganized the entire Big East Conference's defensive assumptions since his first practice, and who was, by the consensus of the basketball world in the spring of 1982, the most consequential recruit in the history of the sport. Jordan's name appeared in the game preview coverage in the context of Carolina's supporting cast. He was a freshman on a team with Worthy and Sam Perkins. He was useful. He was developing. He was not the story. The story was whether Dean Smith, who had coached the Tar Heels to 4 Final Fours and 3 title games before this season and lost every one of them, who had absorbed the criticism that accumulated from those losses in the specific way that coaches absorb criticism that arrives at national volume and refuses to dissipate, would finally win. The story was whether John Thompson's Georgetown program, which had won only 2 NCAA tournament games in Thompson's first 9 years before Ewing arrived, and which had transformed into a championship-level program in the single year of Ewing's presence, would deliver its first national title. The story was Worthy and Ewing and Smith and Thompson, and the 62,000 people in the Superdome who had come to watch something historically significant. Patrick Ewing had grown up in Kingston, Jamaica, had moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts at age 12, and had spent his high school years at Rindge and Latin developing the combination of physical gifts and competitive ferocity that made him the most recruited player in the country in 1981. Every significant program in the sport had pursued him. Dean Smith had pursued him. During Ewing's recruiting visit to Chapel Hill, he witnessed a nearby rally being conducted by the Ku Klux Klan, and the experience informed his decision to choose Georgetown over North Carolina, a fact that gave the 1982 championship game an additional layer of narrative that the participants did not discuss publicly, but that the context carried implicitly. He was 7 feet tall and 240 pounds and had spent his freshman season making every opponent that attempted to shoot over him reconsider whether shooting was the correct choice. John Thompson had instructed him in the early portion of games to contest every shot without concern for goaltending calls, to make his presence physically felt regardless of whether the specific attempt was legal, and Ewing had executed this instruction with the specific ferocity of a player who understood that his value was partly statistical and partly atmospheric, and that the atmospheric value required demonstration early in order to function through the remainder of the game. Prior to Ewing's arrival at Georgetown, the program had won exactly 2 NCAA tournament games in Thompson's first 9 years on the bench. In his first year with Ewing, they reached the national championship game. This was the transformational arithmetic of what a single player can do to a program when the player is Ewing and the program is already well coached and waiting for the architecture piece that makes everything else function. Thompson had built a system whose defensive discipline and collective cohesion were already professional in their sophistication. What it lacked was a deterrent at the center of the lane large enough and ferocious enough to make opposing teams choose differently before they even reached the point of choosing. Ewing was that deterrent. One game that freshman season against Oregon State, he had blocked a shot on one end of the floor, turned, and beaten the entire opposing team to the other end for a dunk. Oregon State, witnesses said, simply gave up. The psychological mathematics of what Ewing represented were real and had been demonstrated at full volume across an entire season before the championship game. In the 1982 national championship game, Ewing was called for goaltending 5 times in the first half, giving North Carolina their first 10 points without the Tar Heels making a field goal. The strategy was working in the sense that Thompson intended. Georgetown led at halftime 32-31 despite the goaltending calls. because the Tar Heels could feel what was waiting for them inside and chose their shots accordingly, and because Ewing and Sleepy Floyd were producing enough offense to keep Georgetown ahead. Floyd was the other weapon in the Georgetown arsenal, a senior guard from Gastonia, North Carolina, who had grown up 2 to 3 miles from Worthy, had attended the same church, and who shot from range with the specific confidence of a player who has been doing it his whole life and sees no reason to stop because the championship game is the venue. Georgetown entered the final with a record of 28-6. They were in the midst of a 15-game winning streak. They were the highest-seeded team to reach the final from the West Regional bracket, and they had beaten their opponents on the strength of Ewing's defensive presence and Thompson's suffocating system. Ewing would finish the 1982 championship game with 23 points, 11 rebounds, 3 steals, and 2 blocks, a double-double that outproduced every other player on the floor statistically. He had played the game of a future first overall draft pick in the national championship game of his freshman year. He was 19 years old, the same age as Jordan. They were both freshmen. They were both at the beginning of careers that would define professional basketball in the decade that followed. Dean Smith had been coaching at North Carolina since 1961, 21 seasons. He had desegregated the program in 1967, signing Charlie Scott as the first black scholarship athlete at UNC, a decision made in the specific historical context of the American South in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement, a context that required more courage from the program's administration than any game result could. He had built the Tar Heels into one of the dominant programs in the sport through a philosophy that valued team cohesion over individual production, player development over immediate results, and the Four Corners offense as a late-game tool that protected leads and forced opponents to foul. He was widely considered one of the great coaches the sport had produced. He had also never won the national championship. The 4 previous title games, in 1968, 1977, 1981, and then again in this 1982 season after earlier losses, had ended in losses, and the losses had produced the specific kind of institutional criticism that attaches itself to coaches who succeed at everything except the final thing. The reputation arrived with phrases like, "can't win the big one," and it had accumulated over the years in the way that reputations of that type accumulate, not through any single formulation, but through repetition, through each subsequent loss providing the previous ones with retroactive confirmation, through the sports press, finding in each new instance the evidence for the narrative it had already decided was true. Smith carried this with the specific dignity of a person who has decided that the work was worth doing regardless of the outcome, and who has built his professional identity around the quality of the process rather than the validation of the result. He had never publicly complained about it. He had continued coaching. The 1982 season, with Worthy and Perkins and a freshman guard from Wilmington, North Carolina, who had arrived at Chapel Hill the previous fall, was his 22nd attempt at the title his record otherwise demanded. What Smith understood about basketball, and what the 1982 championship game would demonstrate in its final possession, was that the preparation for the critical moment had to account for what the opponent was going to do, that every late-game scenario had a structure, and the structure could be modeled in advance, and the model could guide the players through the execution before the pressure of the moment compressed their decision-making. He had prepared for the scenario in the timeout before the last Carolina possession. He had drawn up the play. He had anticipated Georgetown's adjustment. He had told Jordan to shoot if he was open. This was the specific value of 21 seasons of coaching experience at the highest level of the sport. The accumulated intelligence about how pressure situations develop and where the ball should go and who should have it. The shot that Jordan made was not improvised. It was the result of a plan. The plan was made possible by a coach who had lost 4 championship games and understood, from each of those losses, exactly what would be required to win the 5th. The second half of the championship game was contested in the specific rhythm of 2 programs that had prepared for each other with the care that coaches invest when the entire season has been organized around arriving at this moment. The teams traded the lead several times. With 3.5 minutes remaining, Jordan drove to the basket and banked in a shot to give Carolina a 3-point lead, 61-58. Ewing answered on Georgetown's possession with a jump shot, cutting it to 61-60. With 57 seconds left, Floyd hit a 12-foot jumper to give Georgetown the lead, 62-61. The Hoyas were ahead. They had the ball. They had the architecture of a program that had been building toward this precise situation and had arrived at it in the correct configuration. The crowd in the Superdome contained 62,000 different versions of the same response. Something significant was happening. The second half of the championship game was contested in the specific rhythm of two programs that had prepared for each other with the care that coaches invest when the entire season has been organized around arriving at this moment. The teams traded the lead several times. Georgetown's defense, which had finished fifth in the country in points allowed that season, was applying the pressure it had applied all year, collapsing on Worthy in the post, forcing the Tar Heels to operate from the perimeter, requiring every Carolina possession to produce a good shot through a system designed to prevent good shots from existing. Ewing patrolled the paint with the 7-foot authority that had been redefining what offense was possible against Georgetown for the entire season. On the other end, North Carolina's four corners offense, Smith's instrument for protecting leads and managing clock, was converting possessions into time consumed, daring Georgetown to foul and accept the trade of free throws for possession. North Carolina managed to cut the deficit to 2, 56-54, after 5 minutes of the second half. The Tar Heels then obtained a single-point lead with 5 minutes and 50 seconds to play. Georgetown fouled. Jimmy Black converted 2 free throws. Fred Brown made 2 of his own on the other end. 59-58, Carolina. The building's 62,000 were managing noise in waves all game. The Superdome's acoustics conducting 62,000 reactions to a sequence of lead changes that refused to produce separation, that kept both teams and both sets of supporters suspended in the condition of knowing the game could go either way until it didn't. With 3.5 minutes remaining, Jordan drove to the basket and banked in a shot to give Carolina a 3-point lead, 61-58. It was his 7th made field goal of the game. He had been working quietly within the game's larger drama, contributing at a level that was meaningful, without crossing the threshold into the kind of individual prominence that would have altered the defensive attention he received. Georgetown's preparation had been organized around Worthy and Perkins. Jordan was getting his shots from positions available precisely because the defense was not organizing itself around the possibility of Jordan. This was the last time in his career that a defense would make that particular calculation and have it be reasonable. Ewing answered on Georgetown's possession with a jump shot, cutting it to 61-60. With 57 seconds left, Floyd hit a 12-foot jumper to give Georgetown the lead, 62-61. The Hoyas were ahead. They had the ball, or would, as soon as Carolina's possession ended. They had Ewing in the paint and Floyd in range and a defensive system that had been constructed to prevent Carolina from doing in the next 48 seconds what it had been doing for 39 minutes and 12 seconds. The crowd in the Superdome contained 62,000 different versions of the same response. Something significant was happening, and no one in the building could determine which direction it was going to resolve. North Carolina called timeout. Dean Smith gathered his team. He had been in this situation before, in various configurations, and the experience of having been here and lost had produced in him either a precise understanding of what was required or the specific paralysis that comes from knowing too well the history of the outcome. He chose the former. He told his team what the play was. He anticipated that Georgetown, knowing that Worthy was the primary option, would intensify their coverage on the junior forward. He designed the ball to end up with Jordan and told him, if he was open, to shoot. Jimmy Black inbounded the ball on the left side of the court. North Carolina moved it around for the half-dozen seconds that preceded the moment the coaches had prepared for. Georgetown did exactly what Smith had anticipated. 3 Hoya defenders converged toward Worthy, occupying the space where the primary option was expected to be. Black found Jordan on the left wing. Jordan was unmarked. The gymnasium's 62,000 people and the 17 million watching on television, and the broadcast team of Gary Bender and Billy Packer, all processed the same information at the same moment. The freshman who was not the story was about to take the shot. Jordan received the pass at the left elbow. He had 17 seconds on the clock. He did not hesitate. He did not look for another option. He did not attempt to drive. He rose. The same rising motion that would become one of the most documented physical acts in the history of American sport. the elevation that photographers would spend the next 2 decades pursuing from every angle. The jump that the Jordan brand logo would reduce to its essential geometry and reproduce on billions of products across every continent. And he released a 16-foot jumper from the left wing with the form of a player who had been shooting this shot since he was old enough to hold a basketball and had never stopped. The ball went through the net. North Carolina 63, Georgetown 62. 17 seconds remaining. The CBS broadcast team of Gary Bender and Billy Packer called the moment in real time, their voices registering the specific pitch that broadcasters reach when the thing they are watching is historically significant and they can feel it happening. Bender, shot. Jordan, Michael Jordan, Packer, 14 seconds. The number, 14, the clock ticking down from 17 from the moment the ball left Jordan's hands, is the announcement that the possession is over and the outcome of that possession is 63-62 Carolina. Georgetown had their own possession remaining. The game was not yet decided, but the shot had been made by the person Dean Smith had told to shoot if he was open, and Jordan had been open, and he had not required additional persuasion. He had risen and released with the timing and the mechanics of a player who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for this specific invitation. Jordan said afterward that he did not see it go in. He said he could not bring himself to look. He was 19 years old and had just made the most important shot in the history of the University of North Carolina's basketball program in a national championship game in the Louisiana Superdome in front of the largest crowd ever assembled for a college basketball game, and he did not watch it go in because some part of him that was still a freshman from Wilmington, North Carolina, did not yet understand that the shot was his to make and his to watch and his to own. The confidence with which he had caught and risen and released had not yet extended far enough to include the watching. That part would come later. That part would come across 2 decades of subsequent game winners, across 6 championships and 6 finals MVPs, and a catalog of pressure moments that would eventually produce a person who not only made the shot, but watched it go through and turned to the crowd and let the moment belong to him completely. In 1982, he was still learning that he was the person capable of these things. The shot in New Orleans was the first lesson. Georgetown's response to the Jordan basket was immediate. The Hoyas pushed the ball up the floor without calling timeout. They did not panic. They had 14 seconds, a team with Ewing in the paint and Floyd in range, and a defense that had been suffocating teams all season. Fred Brown advanced the ball past half court. He was Georgetown's primary ball handler, the senior point guard who had built his career in Washington on the specific operational intelligence that point guards develop across 4 years of running a program's offense. He turned to pass the ball. He saw a man he recognized as a teammate. He passed. The man he had passed to was James Worthy, standing in the center of the court wearing Carolina blue. Brown had handed the national championship to the wrong team. Worthy caught the pass and ran. He was fouled by Eric Smith on the way to the basket. The officials called an intentional foul, 2 free throws. Worthy missed both. Georgetown's Floyd collected the rebound and launched a desperation shot from distance with the clock expiring. It missed. The buzzer sounded. North Carolina 63, Georgetown 62. The 1982 national championship belonged to Carolina. Thompson walked to Brown at center court and put his arms around him. He held Brown in a specific way, the embrace of a coach who has decided, in the moment that could have broken everything, to communicate only that the relationship was intact. Brown had been Georgetown's senior point guard, the player who had run the program's offense for 4 years and who had made, in the final seconds of the national championship game, the kind of mistake that has no redemption in the conventional accounting of athletic error. The ball went to James Worthy. The explanation was that Brown, in the chaos of a 40-second 62-61 possession with the national championship on the line, his peripheral vision registering movement and the shape of a familiar jersey, had made a decision that was wrong in a way that would be replayed for the remainder of his life. The mistake was not one of effort or preparation or fitness or competitive will. It was one of recognition, a split-second misread in the most pressurized environment his athletic career had produced. Thompson had coached for long enough to understand the difference between the mistake a player makes because they weren't ready, and the mistake a player makes because the moment is difficult, and sometimes difficult moments extract those specific errors from even prepared people. He chose the embrace over the analysis. Jordan, somewhere on the other end of the floor, was just beginning to understand what he had done. Dean Smith, who had lost 4 national championship games before this one and who had spent 21 seasons building the program that this night concluded, had his first national title. The criticism that had been accumulating since 1968, the can't win the big one formulation that the press had found useful and applied with the regularity of someone who has decided the story is settled, was now available for revision. He had won. The work had produced it. The freshman whose name had not been in the primary narrative had made the shot his coach designed for him to make. Smith would not use Jordan's performance as personal vindication in the post-game media availability. He was not built that way. He spoke about his team, paid Georgetown the respect their performance had earned, and honored the game that both programs had spent a season organizing themselves to reach. The team had won. The shot had been Jordan's. The championship was Carolina's. He had been the architect of all 3 of those facts, and he was satisfied to let the facts exist without requiring additional framing. Jordan said many times in the years that followed, in the context of Bulls games, in the context of championship situations, in the context of the specific late-game possessions, where the ball found his hands and the moment required the most from him, that he would sometimes think back to the shot in New Orleans. He said it settled something in him. The mechanism of what it settled was this. Before March 29, 1982, Michael Jordan was a freshman named Mike who was developing into a good college player. After March 29, 1982, Michael Jordan was the freshman who had hit the game winner in the national championship game, who had done so without hesitation at 19 years old in the largest crowd ever assembled for a college basketball game, who had received the pass from Black and risen and released and made it, and who had walked off the floor of the Louisiana Superdome knowing, for the first time in his life specifically, what his relationship to those moments was. He later described the transformation this way. That shot, he said, was the moment Mike Jordan became Michael Jordan. The game contained 7 future Hall of Famers in various states of construction, Jordan and Worthy and Perkins for North Carolina, Ewing and Floyd and Thompson for Georgetown, and Smith on the Carolina bench. And it produced the precise sequence of events that the sport and the culture needed to produce a specific outcome. Ewing finished with 23 points, 11 rebounds, 3 steals, and 2 blocks. He had outscored every other player on the floor. He had played the game of his freshman year in the championship game of his first college season. He lost by 1 point to a shot he did not contest, from a player positioned at the left wing, which was not the paint, which was not where Patrick Ewing lived. Jordan had shot 7 for 13 from the field and finished with 16 points and 9 rebounds. He had been prepared for the shot because Smith had designed the play to find him open if Worthy was doubled, and Worthy was doubled, and Jordan was open, and he had not hesitated. Patrick Ewing would go on to win the national championship in 1984, 2 years later, with a different Georgetown team, and would be drafted first overall in 1985 by the New York Knicks, and would spend 17 seasons in the NBA as one of the great centers of his generation. An 11-time All-Star whose professional career was distinguished by his relationship to the team that took him first. The same New York Knicks who would spend the 1990s repeatedly losing playoff series to Jordan's Bulls. This is the architectural irony that the 1982 championship game produced. The 2 most important players on the floor that night went on to define a rivalry in the next decade. One of them consistently on the winning side of it, and the foundation of that asymmetry was established in some sense at the left wing of the Louisiana Superdome floor on March 29, 1982, when Jordan received a pass from Jimmy Black and rose and did not look and made it. The shot itself, 16 feet, left wing, 17 seconds on the clock, national championship on the line, freshman from Wilmington who was not supposed to be the story, is the first entry in a catalog that would accumulate across the next 20 years of Jordan's competitive life. The catalog includes the shot over Craig Alo in 1989, the game winner over Brian Russell in the 1997 finals, the last shot in 1998 with Russell stumbling, and the championship going to Chicago. It includes the flu game in Salt Lake City in 1997, the performance against the Pacers in 1998, the entire architecture of a competitive career, that produced the most precise answer in basketball history to the question of what happens when a game's result is available to be decided by a single player in a single moment. Each entry in the catalog was made possible in the specific psychological accounting that Jordan maintained about his own relationship to pressure situations by the earlier entry. He had been there before. He had been 19 and unknown and in the largest crowd ever assembled for a college basketball game, and had risen and released and not watched it go in, and then looked up and found it was through. He had done it once. He understood from that moment forward that he was the kind of person who could do it. The catalog kept growing. The first entry, a 16-foot jumper from the left wing in the Louisiana Superdome on March 29, 1982, had made all the subsequent ones possible. Jordan said it himself. That shot was the moment Mike Jordan became Michael Jordan. The distinction matters. Mike Jordan was a good freshman on a talented Carolina team in 1982. Michael Jordan was the person that name referred to after the shot. The person who had discovered, at 19, that his relationship to the most consequential moment his sport had produced was not avoidance or anxiety, but readiness. He did not watch it go in. He did not yet own the full weight of what he had done, but he had risen and released, and the ball had gone through, and the discovery had been made. It would not leave him. The first time you discover what you're capable of in the moment that requires everything, the discovery doesn't leave. It goes with you into every subsequent moment, into every possession that matters, into every arena where the result is available to a person willing to rise and release without looking back. The question is always whether you trust what you already know you can do.